In this video, we're going to carry on learning Blender 3.0 as a CAD user. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video we're going to carry on with our Blender series, Learning Blender as a CAD user. Now, in the last video, what we did is we took a look at Fusion 360 and we tried to understand the workflow that we had. I think setting a good base for the level of knowledge that we have, especially in the Forms tools in Fusion 360, is important so that we can transfer any knowledge that we've gained there and apply it to Blender. Now, as I mentioned, Blender is a poly modeling program. Now, this means that we are modeling with mesh. And of course, it has tons of capability. Things like sculpting, UV editing and texture painting, animations, camera tracking, and so on. But we're going to focus on the basics, the very foundation of working with and manipulating mesh bodies. So the first thing that we're going to do is open Blender, and we're just going to simply start with the new scene. Now, typically what you would do is you would continue to either work with this object or you would create or insert a new object. So once again, what I want to do is I'm going to hide my camera and light. These are going to be the default things that come in. And then I want to select the cube and I want to delete it. So when we take a look at our menus, we've got View, we've got Select, we've got Add, and we've got Object. When we go down to Object, you can see at the very bottom we've got Delete, and it is X on the keyboard. So we're going to select Delete and get rid of the cube. Now we start with a completely blank slate, other than the fact that we have a camera and a light hidden. Now in Blender, it's very similar to Fusion 360 where we can add primitives, and there are of course other ways in which we can define certain objects. But what I want to do is I want to start by adding a new primitive. This can be done by going to Add and picking one of the ones that we want to do. Now, we have looked at this a little bit in the past in one of my videos where we talked about adding or creating subdivisions and exporting and remeshing. But in this video, we're going to start from scratch, and we want to talk about a couple of the most common things that we would do in Blender. So we would come to the Mesh menu, and we have all of these different mesh objects that we can start with. This monkey, I believe the name is Suzanne. This is one of the standard Blender objects that you'll see a lot of tutorials on. And if we click this, what we get is we get this low poly mesh of this monkey. So this can be kind of fun to play around with. You can go into edit mode. You can see how it's topologized. You can do things like add subdivision surface modifiers to it and just simply play around with it. So let's go ahead and add a subdivision surface. Let's kick it up a couple. You can see here at 3, it looks very good. It's nice and smoothed out, and this can be just fun for us to play with. But again, that's not really going to be the focus of what we're doing here. So again, we're going to go to Object and down to Delete. Now that we know how to add and delete objects, let's add something that's useful to our learning process. So we're going to go to Add, Mesh, and you can see that we've got Cube, UV Sphere, Icosphere, Cylinder, Cone, Torus, and then we have the grid and the monkey. Most of the time, when you get started working inside of Blender, you're probably going to begin working in the cube or start with something like a plane. Because this is the standard process that we follow when we're modeling something like a car in Fusion 360, I'm going to start with the plane. It's automatically placed directly on the XY plane. It's centered based on the location of this 3D cursor, and it's just in place. Now, one thing you'll note when we perform an action, in this case adding the plane, a new box will pop up in the lower left-hand corner. Now this box will contain properties of the object that we're adding. So for example, you can see add plane, size 2 meters, generate UVs, align to the world, and then we have its location and rotation. So without using any of the other tools that we have like move, rotate, and scale, we can manipulate things like its size here. Let's say we wanted it to be 4 meters. We just simply hit enter, and now that updates. We can minimize this add plane, and then when we left click inside of the grid system anywhere else, you can see that that option goes away. When we click on it, it's not there anymore, and that's because it was part of the add plane dialog box. Very similar to when we create a primitive in Fusion 360, as soon as we OK that dialog, it is completely gone. We can't get back to it. But of course, We can rescale this, we can move it and rotate it, and we can do anything that we need to it. But what's important at this point is that now we're starting with a complete new base. We have a plane that was created. It's made up of 4 vertices, 4 edges, and 1 single face. So this is a great starting point for us to learn how to insert loop cuts and begin manipulating geometry. Another thing to note is that the units in all the default Blender new designs are going to be in meters. We can modify some of these options by coming over to the left-hand side and looking at some of the properties. It is important to note that the menus that we see on the right-hand side are going to be contextual. So right now, you'll see that we have our plane selected. If we left-click, then we can go into some of our other properties and we can find the location of our units. So anytime we hover the cursor over one of these, it'll display the name. You can see that we have output properties and it shows a little printer icon. We have render properties. We have our layer properties. And then we get down to this one called our scene properties. Inside of our scene properties, we've got units, and we can determine what the units in the scale will be. So you can see right now it's metric, the unit scale is 1, and the length is set to meters. So if you want to make any adjustments to the scale, this is where we would do it. At this point in time, it's not really important to our process because the scale of what we're doing isn't really a factor. But if we were trying to model something that was life size, we would want to know the size of it, and then we would want to use tools like setting the scene units and making sure that we measure it. So right now, if we select measure and we go from corner to corner on this object, what we can do is we can figure out how big this object is. Again, it's not really going to be important for us, so let's focus on the modeling aspect of this, and then we can come back later when we have a project where we really want to focus on its scale. Now that we have this plane, we want to select it and we want to begin editing it. So we're going to select Edit Mode. As soon as we do, the entire thing is selected, including the face, the edges, and the vertices. By default, we will be in Vertex Select mode. And again, once we select a group of vertices that creates a completely enclosed plane, it'll automatically show it highlighted in this red color. Now, if we go and we select an individual vertice, you can see that it's starting to highlight the edges and it fades away as it gets close to the next one. This is true as we go around and make our selections. So the first thing that I want to focus on is going to be the selection process. When we select a single vertex, this is something that we covered in the last video, there are ways in which we can create an instance or a selection as we go around the object. So holding down Control or Command and then clicking another vertice will allow us to pick the shortest path. And just like when we inserted the plane, another dialog appears. Notice that we have some options for face stepping, topology distance, and fill region. We have deselected, selected, and offset. And these values are going to be different depending on our selection. You can see as soon as we get to that fourth corner, it's going to select the entire thing. This is a very simple example because we only have 4 vertices, 4 edges, and a single face. But as we begin to divide this up, it'll start to make a little bit more sense and really streamline your modeling process. Next, let's go to Edge mode. And when we select a single edge and we hold down the Control or Command key, it's going to do the same thing that it did with vertices. You can see again that we've got the dialog where we have our pick shortest path. This time you can see that we've got some options for tagging edges. We're not going to worry about that right now. Mainly we want to focus on the workflow to making these edge selections. And while I did say that I was going to avoid shortcut keys, I do think that making efficient selections on the screen is one of those areas where using the shortcut keys really makes sense. Now in Fusion 360 and plenty of other programs, what we end up doing is doing things like holding down Shift, double-clicking, holding down Control or Alt, and these are ways in which we can make multiple selections. And with that in mind, if we hold down Alt on the keyboard, now if you're on a Mac, you're going to be holding down Option, and we select an edge, nothing happens. But if we hold down Alt and double-click, you can see that it grabs the entire border. Now let's left-click, and let's double-click an edge and see what happens without holding down Alt or Option. You can see that it doesn't create that selection. So again, if you hold down the Alt key, or again Option if you're on a Mac, and double-click this, you can see that it grabs the entire loop. So these are going to be two ways in which it's going to be important for us to select edges, vertices, and faces as we go through our modeling progression. So Alt or Option, if you're on a Mac, and using the Control key. Again, the Control key will pick the shortest path, and it's a quick way for us to work our way through a selection process. The Alt key and double clicking will allow us to create a selection based on a complete loop. Now, the complete loop is going to be the important part of that, because if you're modeling and you don't have an entirely closed loop, or you don't have a good edge flow, then that's not going to work. Okay, so now we have our plane, we know how to select vertices, edges, and faces, and we know some tips and tricks on ways that we can make that selection process a bit easier. Again, Alt or Option, and Control or Command, depending on what system you're working in. Now that we know that, let's go ahead and take a look at inserting edges and doing loop cuts and modifying our geometry a little bit. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use the loop cut option by left clicking, and then we simply need to place the cursor in an orientation, and whenever we see a preview, that's going to be the orientation in which the cut's going to go. We're going to click, and I'm going to place a couple of these, dividing this face up fairly quickly into even sections, because every time we use this loop cut option, it's directly in the middle. Once again, we have the option to go to Edge and use Loop Cut and Slide, which is Control and R on the keyboard. When we use Loop Cut and Slide, we'll be able to place an edge, and then we'll be able to slide it when we insert it. The way that we do that is by holding down the left mouse button, and then we can place it wherever we want. Now, this tool I found works a little bit different if you're on the Loop Cut tool or if you're on the Select Box tool. So when we're on the Loop Cut tool, it behaves like Loop Cut and you need to hold down the mouse button. However, when you're on the Selection tool and we come down to Loop Cut and Slide, it allows us to click the orientation and then slide without holding down the left mouse button. Then we right-click the mouse button to place it back. And once again, you'll notice a new menu appears. We have some options for things like fall off, and that'll become more important as soon as we're not working on a plane. Let's do this one more time, but this time let's use the shortcut key. Control and R if you're on a PC, or Command and R if you're on a Mac. Once again, the first thing we do is pick the orientation, and then we can slide it. And this is how we're going to get a good situation or a good workflow to allow us to create edges that are close to each other. So again, Control and R or Command and R if you're on a Mac, and then we can slide these two together. Now, let's go ahead and hit Escape to make sure that we're not on any tools. We'll left click somewhere around our object, and you can see that our menu disappears. Now, let's go back to our workflow of holding down Alt and double clicking and seeing what we get for our selection. You can see when we do this, when we hold down Alt and double click, that we're not getting a complete loop. When we do it around the outside, even though we've divided it up quite a bit, we do get that full loop. Now let's try Control. If I have this edge selected and I hold down Control or Command if you're on a Mac and just simply select an edge that's several away, then I pick one down here, you can see that it's working in the shortest path, but it doubled back on itself. So one of the ways in which you want to make sure that you are being efficient with your selection is if you know that the shortest path between this edge and this edge is this end, you can hold down the Control or Command key, you can select there, and then you can work yourself down and just simply move down, making intermediate selections as we work our way through an object. Once we have our selections, then we can use our tools like Move, and we can move this up in 3D to make some geometry. So you can see that was relatively quick and easy. So just go ahead and make some edge selections and then move your geometry up in 3D. From here, I'm going to go back into Object Mode, and I'm going to go to my modifiers, go to Add Modifier, and apply a Subdivision surface. I'm going to increase this a couple, and notice what we created was this sort of snake-like hill shape. You'll notice that we have some edges or some creases that are in here, and everything is nice and smooth. I'm not going to apply the subdivision modifier because I want to go back into edit mode and I want to talk about one more thing. Note that this edge is still selected, and you'll notice that we had a harder crease inside of here because we added multiple edges. Once we start to have geometry, it can be a little bit tricky to see all the edges that we've created. This is where going into our viewport shading display or potentially turning on X-ray can be helpful because now we can see through. What I want to do in this case is I'm going to take a look at this edge. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and double click it to grab the entire edge. Then I'm going to go to Mesh, Delete, and Dissolve Edges. If I hop back out into Object mode and I turn off X-ray, you can see that we've created a smoother shading or a smoother edge there by getting rid of just one of those edges. So one of the ways in which we worked in Fusion 360 was for us to add creases whenever we needed to control an edge, and then later on we'd come back and we'd add additional edges. And that's true for Blender as well. But we do have another option in Blender. If we select some edges, so for example, I'm going to just Control select this first edge and this last edge to grab this section here, and then I want to bring out this other menu. Now, in order to bring out this menu, I'm going to go to View and bring out the sidebar. Now, there is a shortcut key for that. You can hit N on the keyboard to bring that out and make it go away. But once we do this and we open up this sidebar, for this selected edge, we have a couple options. We have mean bevel weight here, and then we have mean crease. If I increase this value to 1.0, I've added a complete crease to that edge. And you can see here that we've created this tight corner or this tight edge. If I change this to 0.5, what we've now done is we've added a half weight or somewhere in between that completely smooth and that complete crease. So this is another way in which we can control the edge flow. I think there are some downstream implications to working this way, and I think the preferred method for most people is to insert edges to control the edge weighting. But just note that we do have this crease option that will allow us to come in and make some modifications. Let's go ahead and use the option holding down Control or Command to just work our way back across this ridge all the way to here. And let's increase this crease weight to 0.5. From here, I'm going to hop out of Edit mode back into Object mode, and you can see now we've tightened up that top edge of our object. So this was very quick and easy for us to create this. And of course, we're still working in that low polygon state. If we go back to Object mode or back into Edit mode, you can see that we still have a very small number of faces, edges, and vertices to control. And this is preferable, at least in the modeling phase, to keep the edges, vertices, and faces as a lowest possible count. This is going to be much easier for us to control the geometry. If we need to insert more geometry, we can always do loop cuts, and we can insert them wherever we need to help tighten up that geometry. But for our purposes, I think for right now, let's focus our attention on low poly modeling, making sure we understand the tools that we can use, and then make sure that we understand how to make adjustments and modifications. So now let's go ahead and select this edge. I'm going to Control select this edge. Then I'm going to go into my edge menu, and I'm going to do loop cut and slide. I'm going to put another one here. And then I'm going to hold down the Control or Command key, and I'm going to make some selections. I want to grab this entire edge from here to here. I'm going to move my way over, and I'm going to come all the way back. Now that we have those selected, let's rotate the model around so we can see it from over here. Next, I'm going to move on to my Scale tool. Now, just like we do in Fusion 360, we can scale in a single direction, and if we scale up and down, you can see what we're doing is we're creating sort of an average position based on our selection. One thing about moving the cursor in Blender is it can be a little bit tricky. You can see depending on which direction you're moving the cursor, as you get close to that center, it can be a little bit twitchy. So you need to play around and get comfortable with that. We also do have the option to change the transform orientation based on local, normal, gimbal view, or cursor. Now the cursor one is important because we haven't really learned how we can place the cursor at a specific location yet. The cursor is what we see with this red and white border that's basically at the center of our entire design and the center of our object because we inserted the plane directly in the middle of the screen. Before we talk about that, let's go ahead and move to the Move tool, and let's just pull this edge up while it's selected. So you can see here that we've made a ridge. We didn't add a crease or modify the crease weight. We just put two edges close together. But now let's talk about moving that 3D cursor. In order to move the 3D cursor, there are a couple different ways that we can do this. You'll note that there is a cursor menu here, which allows you to set the cursor, and it says drag to transform. So what this allows us to do is simply move it and place it where we want it. There are other ways to do this, and note that this is just simply moving around because we haven't activated any snap yet. So we're just sort of moving it around randomly in 3D. And in order to get it close to right, what we need to do is switch to a couple different views and then just place it in those views. So this can be helpful for us to sort of drag it into a general location, but if we're trying to be real specific and snap it to something, then obviously it doesn't help. We can also use Shift and right click, and Shift and right click allows us to place the cursor wherever our mouse is going to be. So you can see that this makes it a little bit easier for us to place it at a very specific location. So holding down Shift and right clicking the mouse, I can place it about where I want it. It's still not snapping to anything though. So if we wanted to snap somewhere, then we need to make a very specific selection. So I'm going to go back to my selection dialog. I'm going to select a vertex, and now I want to place the cursor there. Well, in order to place the cursor there, I can't just do a Shift and right click, and I can't use the move option because I actually want to snap it to my selection. So the way that we want to make this work is by coming up to this magnet icon, which is our snap tool. Now the snap tool will allow us to toggle on the ability to snap directly to specific entities. So for example, a vertex. We're going to click on this magnet icon to enable it, and then we're going to hold down Shift and right click and snap it to a vertex. Now, this doesn't necessarily work by using the Shift and right click option, but if we go to the cursor drag option that allows us to drag it, then we can snap it. You can see that it's snapping to edges, and it'll allow us to snap to vertices. So these snap options will allow us to get a little bit closer. We can go to things like edge center, edge perpendicular, closest, center median active, and so on. Now there are other ways for us to manipulate that 3D cursor location, but these are a couple of the most basic ways, using the move and drag option and allowing it to snap, or using Shift and right click. If you're just trying to insert an object using the 3D cursor, then usually Shift and right click will get you pretty close. If you want a specific pivot point, however, then making sure that you place it snap to something can help. Now let's go ahead and again, Control Select. We're going to go all the way to the end here and all the way back. We're going to go to our rotation. This time we're going to go to the side. We're going to just pivot this down. And now what we want to do is we want to rotate based on our 3D cursor. So you'll notice that if we drop down the global option and select cursor and we begin rotating, nothing's happening. That's because our cursor is right in the center. So in order to make this work, we need to use this chain link icon. This is our transform pivot. The transform pivot allows us to select our 3D cursor. So you can see now it's actually moved into position, and we can rotate it based on that selection. So this takes a little bit of getting used to because there are a couple of different ways in which we can modify things. So we've got this transform orientation, and then we've got this transform pivot point. So again, just play around with these options, explore what they're doing, and just make sure that you can find them in the UI. That's going to be the most important thing for right now, is making sure that we can find them. Now let's hop back out into object mode, and you can see what we've created is a pretty intricate looking shape, and we've just simply used a very low poly design. We've moved a few things in space, and we've added a subdivision surface modifier. We can increase or decrease this to get this a little bit smoother. You can see that as we reduce it, we're getting that low poly view, and as we increase it, it's starting to smooth out. And the last thing that I want to say with this object still selected is I'm going to right click on it, and notice that in this object context menu, we have a couple things. We've got shade smooth and shade flat. We've got convert to, set origin, and there's also a couple other options that you can see here. But what we're going to do is we're going to select shade smooth. And shade smooth will give us smooth shading so we don't see all those facets and tessellations. If we select shade flat, let's go ahead and reduce this down a little bit. You can see that we see all those flat faces, and again, right click and shade smooth. This helps us get a little bit of a smoother appearance on our object. There will be some limitations to this, of course, and at this point in time, if we're still modeling, we're not going to apply our subdivision surface modifier. But at any point in time, if you are ready to go to that next step and you want to, what I would say, bake it in, is you can go and use the dropdown and select apply. What this means is when you go back into edit, then you now have probably hundreds of thousands of tiny little squares that you can manipulate. So we need to be very careful when we do this, obviously, because it makes the process much more complicated and much more difficult. There are some ways in which we can get back to the point in which we have a low poly model. So if you accidentally apply that modifier, let's go to our new add modifier and let's take a look at rebuilding this or remeshing this. So we're going to select remesh. We're going to select the smooth option. And we need to change the octree depth and begin to increase this. And we can also work on things like the scale. You'll notice that there is going to be a limitation to the way in which this is going to work depending on the options we're using. We just have an open surface, so blocks isn't really going to be an option, but we can use things like sharp and voxel, and we can use those to remesh our design. But it's always going to be a good idea for us to maintain that low poly object whenever possible. We do also have undo options. So if you go up to undo, we can undo and go back to a situation before we've applied a modifier in some cases, but it's going to be very tricky for us. So again, we've got undo history. You can see here that we've got this add modifier. And let's go back to the select option. And then let's go undo a few more. You can see here, this is our object. We're going to undo again. And then now we're back to our subdivision surface. Now, if we select this and go back into edit mode, we've got our low poly. But there is going to be a limitation. You're not going to always be able to do that. So again, be very mindful of your low poly objects and use subdivision surfaces to change the visual display, at least for now while you're learning. And don't worry about applying that unless you have a good reason. If we were to export this, let's say that I decided to export it as an FBX. When we look down here, we've got several different options. And when we go down to the options here, we've got apply transform, use space transform, apply unit. But there is an option that allows us to go ahead and apply any of the modifiers that we've created. So if we go down into geometry, you see that apply modifiers is turned on by default. So if your intent is to build a low poly object and export it, then you can use this option to go ahead and apply it at the time where you export it, but keep it low poly inside of here. The last thing that I'm going to do with this example is I am actually going to export it as an FBX. And the reason I want to do that is so I can bring it back into Fusion 360. And when we look at this, we have FBX and we have STL. Now, I know recently Fusion 360 has been working on OBJ, STL, FBX, and the data that goes along with those exports. We've already taken a look at the fact that FBX is the main one that brings appearances with it. But now OBJ and STL are also supposed to carry those appearances. So the main thing that I want to do is I want to pick a format that works. STL and OBJ are probably going to be the most relevant, at least for right now, because they allow us to insert it as a mesh. So we're going to select this. We're going to find a place that we want to put it. I'm going to stick it in a Fusion 360's export. I'm going to call this Blender 1. I'm going to export it. Remember, by default, it's going to apply this modifier for us. And then I'm going to hop into Fusion 360, and I want to take a look at bringing that up. So in Fusion 360, the way in which we would do this is we're going to go into Create Form. And inside of Create Form, you can see here that we've got some options where we can convert. And when we select Convert, we can bring in a quad mesh to a T-spline. Now this already has to be in our design for this to work, so we need to insert it first as a mesh. So we're going to start by going back to our mesh workspace. We're going to select Insert Mesh, and we're going to find the mesh that we want to insert. So you can see here that I've got Blender 1 OBJ. I'm going to select it. This brings it in as a nice displayed quad mesh. We're going to say OK, leave it where it is. Then we're going to go into our forms. We're going to go to Convert. We're going to select Quad Mesh to T-spline, select our mesh body, and we're going to say OK. Now what we have is we've converted that mesh directly from Blender into a T-spline body that we can manipulate. I can go back and forth to box display and smooth display, and you can see that we now have control over this geometry. So for example, if I wanted to select a handful of faces, I could use modify, edit form, and I can begin manipulating these. And in smooth display, it's like we're adding more geometry. So again, this is the workflow, and this is one of the reasons why we do want to keep objects low poly, because if we do decide to bring it back into Fusion and convert it to what's considered a B-rep, then we need to make sure that we do keep those quad meshes at a reasonable level. So if I finish the form, I've now taken what I've done in Blender and I've converted it to a true B-rep surface. Taken everything, and the level of detail that we have in the mesh, in the quad mesh, has been converted to a form, and that form has been converted to a surface. And of course, it is still editable. So this is a great workflow that we can consider when we're trying to make these organic shapes, or things that just might be a little bit easier for us to define as a mesh body than as a surface body. Now, we could continue to play around with this as much as we want, but I really don't think that it's very beneficial. So at this point, the important things that I want to make sure that we understand in Blender are going to be the ways in which we can add objects, the ways in which we can make our selections a bit easier by using Alt on the keyboard or Option if you're on a Mac, and by using Control or Command if you're on a Mac. Also, the ways in which we can insert edges, and inserting those edges is going to be a great way for us to use Loop Cut and Slide, or just the Loop Cut tool, and make sure that we are able to move the 3D cursor around, at least at a very basic level for right now. We'll get into more advanced 3D cursor controls in later videos, but for right now, make sure that you are able to move and position it, use your move, rotate, and scale tools, and also that you can use the snap options and that you can change the transform pivot to the 3D cursor, as that's going to be important in some of our workflow. So if you want to continue to play around with this, make sure that you go ahead and save this design. We're going to continue to start from a fresh blank slate every time we start a video, because I think that's the best way for us to practice. If we're starting from scratch each time, then it's continually forcing us to relearn those same tools and reapply them over and over again. In the next video, I plan to start to talk about things like insetting faces and extrudes, and ways in which we can continue to build up our knowledge of creating geometry in Blender. But at this point, if you have any questions, please let me know. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.